Thank you very much for joining us for a rather impromptu, but I hope very worthwhile conversation about a vulnerability that many of you, I trust, are aware of, but that is becoming more urgently in need of national attention and corrective action by the moment. My name is Frank Gaffney. I am the president and CEO of an organization called the Center for Security Policy, which is based here in Washington, D.C., and is sponsoring a somewhat informal, ad hoc coalition we call the Secure the Grid Coalition. And I'm very happy to say we've got 4 distinguished members of that coalition with us, 3 here and 1 virtually in Los Angeles. I'll introduce each of them in turn, but I just wanted to sort of set the stage for our conversation today by taking a moment to express condolences to the families of 2 journalists. We are here in the National Press Club, of course, who have been murdered in recent days by a group that goes by various names, the Islamic State in the Sham, Iraq and the Sham, in Iraq and the Levant, in the Islamic State period, the Caliphate, call it what you will. It is the latest entity to step forth and begin engaging in what the doctrine it adheres to, called Sharia, requires of all Muslims, according to their lights, namely jihad. The jihad that we're here to talk about today might be called grid jihad. And as opposed to the individual beheadings that have become kind of the trademark of, most recently, ISIS or the Islamic State, this could entail a decapitation of a nation. The electric grid of the United States, as my colleagues will elaborate upon, is absolutely indispensable to life as we know it here in the United States, and indeed in most of the developed world. It powers all of the critical infrastructures upon which literally the necessities of life are supplied. The possibility of maintaining a population of the size we have in the United States without electrification and all that it makes possible is unimaginable. Is there reason to believe that if jihadists of the ISIS stripe or some other, or for that matter, other enemies of the United States, could effect the destruction of not just the electric system, but millions of Americans who depend upon it in fairly short order, that the organizations that we now see waging jihad against us would shy away from utilizing such capabilities? I personally think not, but we will talk about it at greater length momentarily. Important to understand is the fact that these enemies know of the vulnerabilities of our grid. They have developed the capabilities to exploit those vulnerabilities, and I think we have to operate on the assumption that they will, at some point, if not in the very near future, try to take advantage of the destructive potential of such an attack. We're going to start in these several presentations with a sort of overview of the nature of the threat environment in which we find ourselves and the sorts of vulnerabilities that the grid is known to have here in the United States, with an old colleague and friend of mine from our days together in the United States Defense Department, Michael Maloof. He worked in that period as one of the senior executives in the Defense Technology Security Administration, responsible for trying to prevent the theft or transfer illegally of sensitive and militarily relevant technologies. He has spent much of the intervening period training others with his skills, including Special Operations Forces units, law enforcement, and the like. He is the author of a terrific book, A Nation Forsaken, EMP, The Escalating Threat, an American Catastrophe. Michael will talk, as I said, sort of at the 30,000-foot level about the challenges that we're facing in terms of grid vulnerability. Michael, welcome. Good to have you with us. Do you want to do it from here?
Sure.
We'll take questions from there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Maloof. I am the author of A Nation Forsaken, came out last year, and I wrote it because I feel that the United States government has failed this country in meeting a major vulnerability, and that is the vulnerability of the grid and dealing with that. And given all of the other threats that we're having to look at today, this nation indeed is very vulnerable. And ISIS is just the latest. EMP will be the icing on the cake from an existential threat from a high-altitude nuclear explosion. But we also have existing threats today, and that is coming in from within and just immediately from without. To give an overview of the threat that we're seeing today, a lot of this has to do now at this point with physical security of the grid system. It's very vulnerable, as we've pointed out. If a squirrel in Ohio can knock out the power lines and get fried in Ohio and knock out the East Coast, it indeed is very, very vulnerable. Given that, we also see these threats that are coming in from, particularly potential threats from Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda is now morphing more and more into ISIS, the Islamic State. There is a history of ISIS or Al-Qaeda working with your drug cartels, your MS-13 in Latin America. Ever since I've been at the Defense Department, and I retired from there in 2004, we had information on those exchanges and on those relationships. They've only enhanced since because Al-Qaeda uses the drug cartels to transfer their drugs into Africa and indeed Asia and all around the world. So there is a relationship that has existed for more than a decade, if you will, between Al-Qaeda and the drug cartels. We also have information, and this comes from some old intelligence, and I presume it's been declassified by now, but that Al-Qaeda has also begun to work with MS-13. Given this development and the fact that we now know that they're in Latin America, MS-13 and the drug cartels already are in the United States. They exist in some 1,200 U.S. cities. I live in Reston. There's a bunch of them right in Herndon, right next door to me. The threat is there. And that the concern is that they can easily come through the southern border. Certainly ISIS operatives could easily come through the border, and because they are rich and have tremendous amounts of money, they easily can wire funds anywhere in the United States to have something done. And what is that vulnerability? Because they already have proxies in place in these 1,200 cities, the concern I have had, and I'm sure others are beginning to see that, is that ISIS, which is very knowledgeable of this vulnerability, can get in touch with those operatives and make it happen. Now, I say that because we may already be experiencing that to some extent, because there have been some unexplained attacks already on our grid systems in various locations throughout the United States. The most famous, of course, is Metcalf out in California, in San Jose. Then we had another recent case, in spite of all the physical security, a break-in at Metcalf within the last week, I believe. The vulnerability for the grid systems are there, and the way they took down in Metcalf in 2012 was to shoot up the transformers in very precise locations with AK-47s. Somebody knew how to hit those transformers. I'm not saying it was ISIS, but it could be somebody who was probably planning, preparing for something larger. And of course, we have September 11th right around the corner. So I'm beginning to connect some of these little dots and seeing a potential for a catastrophic event. There was a case in Arizona, I believe earlier this year, and then we had some other cases of unexplained damage and destruction of transformers in New Jersey. The Intelligence Bureau up there reports that there have been a number of instances where the transformers and the grid were directly attacked because people knew what they were looking for. Now, we've also had in recent days new information from Judicial Watch, which has just given us an alert from intelligence sources saying there's a lot of chatter going on south of the border in Juarez, Mexico. And the Mexicans are saying, oh, that's not possible, that's not possible. Well, the reality is that 3 hardened Ukrainian criminals came into the United States directly from Mexico undetected. They can bring in their own people, in addition to wiring money to wherever they want to have a hit. Now, because ISIS knows where these transformers are, the major transformers in the United States are, that help us keep our energy flowing. If they knock out 20 of them in the United States, they're going to hit the most critical 9 that will blank out the U.S. from coast to coast. And that's the kind of vulnerability we're looking at, in spite of all the statements from the utilities that it's not a problem, we can protect it. But I believe in preventative action, and we're not doing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Next, one of the country's preeminent authorities on matters involving particularly the vulnerability of the grid to the phenomenon that Michael alluded to, electromagnetic pulse, but more generally on the challenges that we face in terms of assuring that the power stays on, is Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. Peter was a career CIA analyst specializing in nuclear weapons threats, served as a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee, was one of the staff members on the Electromagnetic Pulse Threat Commission, congressionally impaneled, is currently the executive director of the Congressional National and Homeland Security Task Force. Peter is also an author. He has 2 books, Apocalypse Unknown, The Struggle to Protect America from an Electromagnetic Pulse Catastrophe, and Electric Armageddon. Peter Pry has recently been published and heard from on the radio, assessing specifically the problem of an ISIS connection with the sorts of vulnerabilities that Michael described at the macro level. And we asked Peter to talk a bit about that, and also the possibility that if none of these other things happen, the grid is vulnerable to naturally occurring phenomena. Peter Pry.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Frank. Bring up my first slide. Before we talk about ISIS, let's talk about some of the other threats. The first slide. Yes, right there. Down a little bit so they can see it. Okay. Talk about the natural EMP, the thing that Frank mentioned last. Here is an actual photograph. It's not an artist's conception of a coronal mass ejection. A Carrington-class coronal mass ejection could cause a super geomagnetic storm, such as the 1859 Carrington event. The little blue dot down below is the approximate size of the Earth. So you don't have to be an astrophysicist to know if a CME of that size hits the Earth, it's going to ruin everybody's whole day. You know, the bottom line is NASA put out a report a few weeks ago that said that we were narrowly missed back in 12th of July in 2012 by a Carrington-class coronal mass ejection like that we were narrowly missed by it. And had it struck the Earth, it would have had catastrophic consequences for electric grids everywhere on Earth, just like the Carrington-class 1859 event had catastrophic consequences for telegraph systems and the primitive electronics of their day. But our modern electronic societies cannot survive without electricity. They further concluded, they warned that the likelihood of something like this happening is 12% per decade. 12% per decade, which virtually guarantees that in our lifetimes or the lifetimes of our children, we will experience a natural EMP catastrophe. Go to the next view graph. We're talking further so that they have the whole thing. Thank you. You know, we're talking about ISIS today, but last year it was North Korea. It's almost forgotten now, but you may recall that back in February and March and April of last year, Kim Jong-un was threatening to make a nuclear missile strike on the United States, and we were in a major nuclear crisis with North Korea. And the administration took this so seriously, we were flying B-2 bombers over the demilitarized zone to deter North Korea from acting on these threats. A threat that many believe they could have delivered on. I believe it, because in the midst of that crisis, on April 16th of last year, they orbited, their KSM-3 satellite was passing over the east coast of the United States, passing over the eastern grid, which is at the ideal altitude and location for collapsing the electric grid of the United States. The eastern grid is particularly important because it generates 75% of our electricity, and we can't survive without the eastern grid. On April 16th, this is showing the track of the KSM-3 satellite during the nuclear crisis with North Korea. And if you look at the track on April 16th, that's the blue track that has the number 16 on it. The KSM-3 was passing over the Washington, D.C., New York City corridor. And it would have put a peak EMP field down on our financial center and on Washington, D.C., the political capital of the country, and been able to take down the whole eastern grid. So it was optimally located, both in altitude and trajectory, to do an attack of that sort. And April 16th happens to be the very day, on that very day on the western grid, on the west coast, is the day the mysterious attack happened on the Metcalf transformer substation on April 16th, 2013. That the U.S. FERC later concluded, was a professional job by military commandos, or at least it appeared to be that, because highly professional, looked like a team of 6 professionals that used AK-47s, the favorite sidearm of terrorists and rogue states, and they got away scot-free. It was well planned, well executed. Let's go to the next view graph. A few months after the North Korean KSM-3 satellite orbited over us in July of last year, a North Korean freighter was intercepted trying to go back to North Korea after being in the Gulf of Mexico, carrying SA-2 nuclear-capable missiles on board. Now, they didn't have nuclear warheads on them, but this might have been an exercise to see if, in addition to being able to get away with the satellite, they might have been able to get short-range missiles off of our coast, which was the nightmare scenario of the EMP Commission, because you can keep your fingerprints off of an EMP attack that way. The idea is you launch a short-range missile from the hold of a freighter. And these 2 SA-2 missiles, it's depicted in that picture, were in the hold of the freighter on their launchers. And they were in the right location. We never would have known about it if they hadn't tried to sneak back through the Panama Canal. And we found them hidden under 10,000 bags of sugar. Next view graph. October 27th of last year, a terrorist drug cartel, the Knights Templars, blacked out a province in Mexico, put 420,000 people into the dark so they could cut them, isolate them from the federales, so they could go into the towns and villages and drag political leaders into the public square who are opposed to the drug trade and publicly execute them. So terrorists have attacked the grid. I mean, it has been done just south of our border, and the Knights Templars know how to do it. And if Neanderthals like the Knights Templars have figured out that the electric grid is a major societal vulnerability, well, what is ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China? What have they got planned for us? Next. On June 9th, when all of the media attention was focused on ISIS doing its blitzkrieg across northern Iraq and taking over northern Iraq, this event happened, and it got very little notice. Where Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is one of the most ingenious of the terrorist groups. They're the ones that sabotage the coal. They're the ones that have figured out how to put explosives into printer cartridges and are constantly trying to send bombs back to the United States in very imaginative ways. They blacked out the entire grid of Yemen. It's the first time in history, June 9th, 2014, just a few weeks ago, that an entire nation has been put into blackout by a terrorist attack. And this might not be an isolated incident, by the way. A year earlier, if you go back to July of 2013, a year before this happened, there had been a meeting that the administration leaked. They conducted an unprecedented evacuation of many of our embassies in the Middle East, all over the Middle East, because there had been a meeting of what some people in the intelligence community called a Legion of Doom. So all the major terrorist groups, which included Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which has now morphed into ISIS, okay? And they were all planning on some big operation. We don't know what it was. The administration didn't know what it was, but they were so concerned about this imminent threat that we evacuated the embassies. Could it be that a year later, this ISIS offensive that is rolling over Iraq, the blackout of Yemen, the Taliban attacks in nuclear-armed Pakistan are not isolated incidents? They were working together a year ago. Is this the plan that's unfolding now before us? So the bottom line is terrorists have figured out the electric grid is a major vulnerability. We know that, as Mike mentioned, that we haven't repaired those vulnerabilities. That the incursion on the Metcalf transformer substation, again, on last Wednesday, it was August 27th, just last Wednesday, this happened after, as a result of the April 16th attack, all right? North American Electric Reliability Corporation passed an emergency new standard for physical security that was supposed to be implemented to protect our electric grid, emergency standard. And PG&E, that owns the Metcalf substation, spent millions of dollars, they said, to protect that station so it would never happen again. And what happens? It's broken into again, and the bad guys get away scot-free. Now, when the first attack, the electric power industry tried to dismiss it and call it vandalism until additional research was done, and people said this isn't vandalism. This was probably a terrorist operation. This was a professional attack. Now they're dismissing this latest operation as theft, vandalism again. As reporters, I would ask you to be skeptical of these claims, since they have lied to us before. As a former CIA officer, I know that when you're doing a clandestine operation, for example, breaking in to rob secret documents from a safe, for instance. You don't just take the document you want. You take everything in the safe and you pick up any other valuables that are around the room in the hope that maybe your victim won't figure out that this was an intelligence operation. Maybe they'll just think it was a thief, a normal theft. So if I were ISIS or Al-Qaeda or a criminal group that's being paid by ISIS, that's exactly what I do. I'd break in to find out, have they really improved security? And I'd steal a few things so that these people would just think it's, vandalism or something. Since the electric power industry is so desperate to believe there isn't a threat, and is so desperate to convince the public that everything's okay, it was just a normal kind of a threat. Over the weekend, Mike referred to the chatter that was picked up, along the Texas border about ISIS apparently being in communication with criminal groups in Mexico. I need to wrap up here quickly, but I'm very frustrated, because there seems to be a push on by the administration to try to make the American people, to reassure them, give them false reassurances that ISIS is not an imminent threat to the United States. Mike Morrell, who former acting director of the CIA, has been on television saying, it would take them a year or two to put together a 9/11 type attack against the United States. As I was driving in for this press conference, I heard on the radio that apparently the director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, publicly stated that ISIS is not an imminent threat to the United States. Well, I respectfully disagree with that point of view. They've got the capabilities. They're the richest terrorist organization in the world. Their colleagues have demonstrated that they know the electric grid is a major vulnerability. There was a study, one of the studies I didn't mention was put out by U.S. FERC last year, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that said if you attack just 9 transformer substations, 9 key transformer substations. You could black out the whole United States for weeks or months. You know, the president says he's got a phone and a pen. Well, ISIS has got a phone and a pen too. All they have to do is call up these criminal gangs, the Knights Templars who've got experience at blowing up grids, send them a check. Use that pen to write a check and wire them $10 million or something like that. They'll do anything for money. And they can come across our border and black out Arizona or New Mexico or New York or Minnesota or maybe the whole country. Maybe the whole country. They could figure out where those 9 transformer substations are using computer models that are available on open source. So, you know, we are facing an imminent threat to ISIS. And it's an asymmetric threat, you know, because they know that our electric grid is a major societal vulnerability and we haven't done anything to protect it. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, Peter. Peter Pry mentioned this issue of whether or not it is imaginable that this kind of attack could take place. And I just would call to mind, he alluded to 9/11, the anniversary of it coming up next week. One of the insights from the 9/11 Commission as to what happened on that horrific occasion 13 years ago, as you may remember, was we had a failure of imagination. The question is whether we're failing to imagine the sorts of things that could happen here. You've heard a number of dots. We leave it to you to connect them. But I want to turn next to another distinguished member of the Secure the Grid Coalition. And I forgot to note that the honorary chairman of this, co-chairman of this commission are former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich and former Clinton Director of Central Intelligence Jim Woolsey. They've been very actively involved with this as well. I could not be here today. But Henry Cooper is. Ambassador Cooper has a distinguished record of service, both in the public sector and in the private. He was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force with responsibility for research, development, and acquisition, specifically of strategic and space systems, which gave him, in addition to his mechanical engineering degree, is what I'm trying to say, deep experience with what we can do to protect things of value against the sorts of threats that Peter and Michael have just described. He also served as Assistant Director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, was President Reagan's ambassador to the Defense and Space Talks in Geneva for 5 years, and also was President George Herbert Walker Bush's Director of the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization. Again, a man with a great pedigree in understanding both the sorts of vulnerabilities that the U.S. military has countered over the past 50 years and that could be of direct relevance to what we're trying to protect against right now. And Hank will also talk a little bit about why we haven't protected the civilian grid in the way we have these defense assets. Mr. Ambassador?
Thanks, Frank. Often when I talk with people about this, the underlying assumption of the audience is that this sounds really strange. You know, if it really were this bad, we'd be doing things about it. And so there's a bias initially that maybe this is a made-up threat. And I want to explain to you why it isn't. And I can do this out of my own personal experience. Back when I was a lieutenant in the Air Force in the 1960s, I was at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we discovered the event, the EMP effects, was on a high-altitude experiment conducted in 1962 in the South Pacific. And it turned out the lights in Hawaii some 900 miles away. It also caused other damage there. If they had had modern electronics, not vacuum tube electronics of that day, it would have been a catastrophic event for the state of Hawaii. We weren't surprised that there was an EMP on the test, but we were surprised by the extent of it and the consequences. And as a consequence of that experience, it went black. It went very classified. And we took special precautions to harden our strategic systems and the ability, the means of the president to communicate with his strategic forces, so that if the Soviets were to ever attack us and use this as a preliminary tactic to set off a nuclear explosion above the atmosphere to break that communications, that the president still could maintain his control of our strategic forces to retaliate. So we hardened all sorts of equipment. We hardened the president's airplane. We hardened the commander of Strategic Air Command's airplane. We hardened the aircraft that were used to assure that we could communicate with the submarines at sea, the TACAMO, so-called, and built a big trestle, it was called, out in Albuquerque, made entirely of wood so that there were no conductors in it, no nails or anything of that sort, and exposed to simulated EMP testing. We tested our ICBMs and SLBMs, the silos in which our systems were based up in 5 bases around the central and northwestern part of the United States. These things were done in considerable secrecy. The problems were never made public in an extensive way. Local people, of course, knew that we were doing these sorts of things, but it remained very classified. What they didn't realize, and most people still don't realize, is that we didn't do anything to harden the critical infrastructure of the nation, nothing really to assure the communications would survive, even the normal communications. And as a matter of fact, we were so unsure of how we could accomplish that, that we built redundant communications to assure that the commander of Strategic Air Command could communicate with our bombers and make sure that they could be launched in the case of an attack. Now, this was speculation that the Soviets would do this for many years. But after the Cold War was over, we found in discussions with Soviet scientists and military people that indeed they had planned to do that, and that they understood what this could do to our society as a whole. Peter can tell you about this. This was all done in conjunction with the EMP Commission, which was chaired by what was, when I was at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, Lieutenant Bill Graham, who later became Ronald Reagan's science advisor, NASA administrator, and the chairman of the EMP Commission. He's worked entirely his whole career worrying about EMP-related issues. So there's no doubt that it could happen. There's no doubt that we know how to harden the systems against these effects because we did it 40, 50 years ago. And I oversaw those programs, as Frank was referring to, in the Air Force Secretariat in the 1970s and early 80s. So there's no doubt that this is a problem. We know what was done then can be done to harden the electric grid and other key elements of our critical infrastructure in this country if we simply apply the means to go do it. I want to mention a couple of things. Peter started talking about the solar threat, and that is a threat, and it's going to happen. It's just a matter of when it's going to happen. Many people want to talk about that to the exclusion of the EMP, the threat of a nuclear explosion, because they think this is just an excuse to be champions for missile defense, because that's the threat could be handled, deployed by a ballistic missile. And I understand that, and if it will help us get the message across, I'm entirely happy to see that as the lead in the way we go. But you should understand that solar threat, as dangerous as it is, isn't as dangerous as a nuclear-produced threat. If you look at the details of the EMP that's put out, it not only includes the long wavelength component that comes with the solar threat, and that couples into the grid network and focuses the energy on the centers like the Metcalf station and so on, and that's what fries or destroys the ultra high frequency components there. And those can't be replaced. These are the transformers that we don't build in this country anymore. They're the size of a diesel engine. They're built in Germany and South Korea. And if the transportation systems go down, you're without any power until you build them by hand. Even in those countries today, they take the better part of a year to build one. So, I mean, that is a major danger. The nuclear threat, though, produces two other components. One is, I'll call it the center one, without getting into details. It's basically lightning. We don't know how to deal with lightning. That's surge arresters. And the other one is a very short wavelength pulse, and that is what destroys the solid-state electronics in your car, in your SCADA systems that are prevalent throughout the country. These are the little computers that go with your security system. They're part of practically everything you do anymore. You won't be able to use your cell phones, et cetera, even if the towers worked. So it's very important that if we get to the point of hardening the grid, we harden it against all of the effects, not just the long wavelength portion of the pulse, which is associated with the solar threat. Beyond those points, I think it's important to understand that it will take a while to harden the grid, and I'm all for doing it, and we really ought to have started it yesterday. There are things that we can do to defend against the near-term threat, and I am going to talk about ballistic missile defenses slightly. You don't have to build a lot of new systems to do this. You do have to train to use the ones we have, and you have to augment them with some key sensors. Our Aegis sea-based system is capable of shooting down short, medium, intermediate range. It's demonstrated intermediate range capabilities. And so our crews on board our ships along the eastern seaboard and the west coast and so on have this inherent capability if they're prepared to employ it today. It also has the inherent capability of shooting down ICBMs, I will note, something that Frank and I have been arguing we ought to be doing explicitly now for a decade and still aren't. And that would be a means of protecting those of us along the eastern seaboard. All you need is a radar up in Maine to empower the ships that are normally in Norfolk to protect those of us along the east coast from an Iranian ICBM. These ships don't go into the Gulf of Mexico, so if you're worried about the case that Peter was talking about, a short or medium-range missile in the Gulf of Mexico, we're completely vulnerable to that threat path. And I'm an advocate there putting Aegis ashore sites at several military bases around the Gulf of Mexico. These are the same systems that we're deploying in Romania and Poland to protect our allies against Iranian missiles. I think we can afford to protect the American people as well. And in addition, if we had a sensor or two out in the right places, our existing Aegis ships and the system in Vandenberg Air Force Base, the ground-based system, can be used to shoot down the satellite that Peter spoke of. And both North Korea and Iran have launched satellites over the south polar regions. Our missile defenses are all arrayed to deal with ICBMs that come over the North Pole. We're completely vulnerable to the threat from the south. So there are things that we can do. We know how to deal with them. They're affordable. The kinds of modifications I'm talking about to the missile defenses are not major expenses. And certainly the cost of fixing the grid, hardening the grid, is not expensive. The only issue is whether or not we'll do it. And I'm of the opinion that Washington and our leadership here is desperately broken. And the American people need to get this message and demand more of their representatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Well done. Just to underscore a point that Hank made in the course of those very important remarks, we have for you outside copies of a compilation of the executive summaries of 11 different studies that have been done by the federal government over the past decade. We entitled it Guilty Knowledge: What the U.S. Government Knows About the Vulnerability of the U.S. Electric Grid But Refuses to Fix. This simply documents, I think unequivocally, the point Hank made. This is not a made-up threat. This is not a threat that our government discounts or disbelieves. It's just that they have failed to take the steps that their own studies, 11 of them over 10 years, whether they were focused on the solar problem that Peter talked about, the physical sabotage threat, cyber warfare vulnerabilities, or this electromagnetic pulse phenomenon, all of them conclude the same way. These constitute existential threats to the nation if they eventuate and take down the grid for any length of time. One of the other people who has joined this Secure the Grid coalition, I'm very pleased to say, from afar, but has been very, very actively involved with us, is Kelly Carlson. You probably are familiar with her very successful work in Hollywood. She was one of the stars of Nip Tuck, Starship Troopers 2, several CSIs, Melrose Place, and other very noteworthy commercial and artistic successes. She has thrown herself into this effort to help the American people understand the dangers that we're facing, whether it is from groups like ISIS or some of the nation states, drug cartels, or simply naturally occurring phenomenon, with real gusto, and helped, as a result of her leadership, bring a number of others in Hollywood to help us. I'd love to have Kelly say a few words about her own thoughts on this subject, what has brought her to become involved with the Secure the Grid Coalition, and to introduce 4 videos that we are rolling out starting today with placement at Breitbart.com, and we're hoping in other outlets across the country in the days to come, all designed to help alert the American people to the sorts of vulnerabilities we've talked about here and the need to take corrective action. Kelly Carlson, welcome. Good to have you with us via Skype. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Frank. Thanks so much for having me. Well, my point of view is more of a civilian understanding of national security. And for 2 years, I worked on the maritime border of the United States and kind of threw myself in understanding what the reality was of our security. And one of the things that was not easy for me to learn was kind of perception's everything. And I'm sure along with the majority of the people in the United States, have this idea of what the U.S. has for its borders. I would have assumed we had this crazy, high-tech, anything you can imagine type of national security. And I learned that not to be true so much, especially in the maritime environment. And so I would say our problem is the fact that perception is everything, and our perception keeps getting probed, and we're not doing anything about it, which is very scary. Now, relaying that to the public is a huge task, because you would never believe the reality of our grid. And, you know, most people have a very hard time wrapping their head around it unless they sit and talk to you, Frank. Then they kind of see the light. So what I've been working on and with Frank is how do we relay this to the public, of course, without giving away sensitive information to terrorist groups, but educating the people so they can assist us on applying some pressure maybe to fix these grids or work with the energy companies, whatever it takes to do this. Because I will tell you, living in California, in 2012, my power went out from a solar flare, or a solar shower. And then I remember seeing Metcalf. It was covered one day on the news, but I watch it all the time, so I happened to see it. So just me alone has experienced 2 out of the 4 or 5 ways that our grid can be knocked out. I mean, that's a lot. Unfortunately, people here in California don't necessarily pay attention to those things. Another thing is being engaged to a tracker and a survivalist. I have quite an idea of how immensely difficult it would be to live off the grid. And that's another thing that I try and express to people. Some people have actually said to me, oh, it would be fun if the power went out. No, it would not be fun. And so that's another kind of goal that I have, is to educate people of also what the actual reality would be if the grid was knocked out. I mean, some people really think they could still call their parents, so that they can't wrap their mind around the gravity of the situation. So with that said, oh, one more thing. Just to kind of compound on what everybody's talking about, I spent a couple weeks down on the border this July. And yeah, people need to understand that terrorists are coming across our borders because our coyotes carry Urdu dictionaries so that they can communicate with them. There was also an instance, we spent some time at the Vickers Ranch in Falfurrias, Texas, that this immigrant woman actually turned herself in because she was concerned about 2 Middle Eastern men in her group. I mean, I'm sure she was a decent woman, but it very much concerned her. She turned herself into Border Patrol. And people need to understand that a good portion of the people coming across the border are not Mexican. I mean, they're from other countries. You have the Russian mafia that is helping coordinate all this. One of their old tricks is to knock the power out. You have the Knights Templar situation. People need to open up their eyes a little bit and start putting the pieces of this puzzle together, because it's coming closer much quicker than probably we would have assumed it would. But so anyways, with Frank's help, we have put together some videos for the public, some sort of PSAs, if you will, with Bob Hamer, who was 27 years undercover FBI. He took down things like the Supernote, surface-to-air missiles with North Korea. He's done it all. Joel Lambert, who is a retired Navy SEAL. He has a TV show on Nat Geo. And then my fiance, Dan, who is NSW and also a tracker. So I hope you guys like it. And are you going to be playing it, Frank?
Yes, we are. We're going to roll it now, if we can, please.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And
Yeah.
again, your help and leadership out in California has been greatly appreciated, particularly among the people who aren't paying attention
Right.
to this problem out there. We're glad you are.
Thank you.
We have 4 of these. The first one, I believe, is the one that will go up, is up today on Breitbart.com. I also want to thank Dimos Chrysos, who's helped us with all of this. Do we have the audio synced?
Assault on a California power station.
Snipers using AK-47s.
They completely knocked out the substation.
This was an unprecedented and sophisticated attack.
It's a terrorist attack.
Domestic terrorism.
If they were part of a larger group, it would be possible to hit multiple substations and theoretically bring down the U.S. grid.
Some people claim it's paranoid to believe that there are people who want to destroy America. I spent 4 years as a Marine and 26 years in the FBI protecting this country. It isn't paranoid to think people are planning to kill you when people are planning to kill you.
Today, every single American is facing a clear and present danger. It's called an electromagnetic pulse attack.
All it would take is for one bad guy to detonate a couple of high-altitude EMPs somewhere over the middle of the country, and the entire U.S. electric grid is fried.
If the grid goes down, no lights, no power, no food, no water. And that's just the beginning.
Hardliners in Iran still promise death to America, and the war doctrine of both China and Russia include EMP attacks against us. North Korea has already been caught smuggling nuclear-capable missiles and launchers through the Panama Canal.
We don't have to be victims again. We've been warned. We need to secure the grid. now. Did you know that on April 16, 2013, our nation suffered a terrorist attack?
At about 1 in the morning, unknown assailants broke into 2 underground vaults and cut communication lines, including the 911 alarm for the Metcalf transmission substation.
Snipers then fired 120 rounds at the cooling radiators used for 17 of the substation's high-voltage transformers.
The attack was over in minutes, and the assailants have never been apprehended or identified.
If the terrorists hadn't missed cutting a key communication link, the transformers would have overheated, and all of Silicon Valley and much of the San Francisco Bay Area could have been blacked out.
These terrorists laid out stone markers for the shooters in advance. They left 0 fingerprints or DNA on any of their shell casings. They executed their escape route with professional precision. As a former member of Naval Special Warfare, I know what a terrorist attack looks like. It looks just like this.
We've been warned. We don't need another 9/11. We need to secure the grid now.
Again, Kelly, thank you very much for your creative help with that, and Joel and Bob and of course Dan. And again, Dimos Christos, who was enormous help, as was Chris Brigard in California. This is going to be part, we hope, of an ongoing and increasingly intensive campaign, not least because at the same moment that the various threats that we've just been describing for you are taking place, there is some indication that there may be some steps taken by the Congress to begin the process of the sorts of corrective actions that Hank Cooper alluded to. I want in particular to thank the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, Congressman Michael McCall of Texas, who has indicated that his committee will mark up this month legislation called the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, which will establish as one of the national planning scenarios for the Department of Homeland Security a threat modeled along these lines, EMP and related assaults on the grid. It won't be enough, frankly, to harden the grid as it should be, but it is an important first step. And not least, I hope that it will set the predicate for further legislative action. In the Senate, Congressman Ed Markey has introduced the GRID Act, a piece of legislation that, with his help, passed unanimously in the House a few years ago. And a similar piece of legislation has been introduced by Congressman Trent Franks and Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, called the SHIELD Act in the House of Representatives. And I just want to close by making this last point. As the involvement of these legislators indicates, people on both sides of the aisle recognize that this is an issue that transcends partisan politics. We've all had our fill of it, I'm sure. It's refreshing to have an opportunity for people to come together, both in political life and across the country, without regard for political philosophy or party affiliation, to fix this potentially existential danger to the American people and indeed to our country. With that, we'll be delighted to take any questions you may have. If you would, please identify yourself, and if you have somebody you'd like to direct your question to, name them. If not, we'll just take our best cut at it. Thank you again for coming, and over to you. Both. Well, our hope is that we will get them in front of enough eyeballs that it will be both, Paul. The purpose, as you know, having been in this business a long time, is to try to create a sense of awareness on the part of the public that creates a sense of of urgency on the part of their elected representatives. Again, I don't think any of us take any pleasure in this. All of us would rather not be here, and certainly not with the grim prognosis we've given you. But I've got to believe, and I'll invite my colleagues to address this as well, I've got to believe that even without these ads, members of Congress have been seeing what's going on around the world, and as they come back to town next week, they will want to address something that I'm confident their constituents have been raising with them as well. If not the specifics of the grid and this idea of grid jihad, at least the degree to which we are now vulnerable here in this country. We have a mic. Does anybody else want to speak to that? If not, go ahead. Please, Mike.
Matt Boyle from Breitbart. And so what I wanted to ask is, if it isn't politics that's standing in the way of getting something done on this, why hasn't it already been done? Like, what is standing in the way of getting the solutions here?
Great question. Who would like to address that? Peter, why don't we start with you, and then use the mic, please. Sure. Then Hank, Mike, if you want to.
Is this on?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, actually, it is politics that's standing in the way of getting it done, and its specific name, the most is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is basically, it's supposed to be the organization that looks out for the reliability of the electric grid, but it's the former trade association for the electric power industry and acts like the lobby for the electric power industry, and their primary objective has been to forestall any additional government regulation that would require them to protect the grid against EMP, against cyber effects, even against falling tree branches. You know, I think one of the most interesting examples here of their opposition is, you know, the great Northeast blackout of 2003 that put 40 to 50 million Americans in the dark was basically caused by a power line coming in contact with a tree branch. And it took them a decade to come up with a new vegetation management plan, a decade, you know, to fix the vegetation threat. And they're not interested in, and they've explicitly said that nuclear EMP attack is not their job, that's the job of the Department of Defense. Well, we all respectfully disagree. DOD doesn't have the jurisdictional capability. It doesn't own the grid. It's up to them to protect the grid. Did you want to, Hank?
Yeah, I just go a little bit further than what Peter had to say. It is political, and I think that the creation of Congress is the combination of FERC, which is the regulatory authority in working this, but FERC has no teeth. It has no resources to really carry anything out on its own, so it writes recipe, if you will, or ask for studies done by NERC, and NERC does the will of the electric power companies. And the power companies, understandably, don't want more regulation. But frankly, some things need to be regulated by the federal government. Peter likes to use the FAA to talk about, you know, how would you like flying around if you didn't have FAA oversight and teeth, actually, to deal with problems in aviation. My preference is to use the Federal Drug Administration or agency or whatever it is, the FDA, because in my mind what we have is similar to what it would be like if all of the people who produce their drugs sold their drugs. You know, I mean, and they just made whatever claims like the old West traveling salesman, you know, for their, with nobody looking over their shoulder to make sure that what you were taking as medicine really was safe. And that's the circumstance I believe we're in with the electric power companies' self-regulation and so on. And it really needs to change.
Mike?
Yeah, I think as well it's politics, and it's a lack of priorities, strategic vision, strategic thinking on the part of this administration. For this reason, we mentioned the Department of Homeland Security. The president could take his wonderful pen and with an executive order direct the Department of Homeland Security to make EMP one of its national planning scenarios today. The problem of not doing that is that at the state and local levels, they take their cue from what DHS does in terms of preparation. And if at the federal level, they're not prepared. They're certainly not going to be prepared at the state and local levels, and that is a crime, as far as I'm concerned. And I think it really calls for us re-examining the need to bring back these civil defense facilities that we had during the Cold War, at the height of the Cold War, where you have food and medication and water stored, so people, assuming that there's no communications, they know where to report to in the event of such a catastrophic development.
I want to add just to what Mike said. Civil defense organization once was in the Department of Defense. And DOD, let's face it, is the organization which knows more about the subject as I described it for the reasons I described. This is where the technology was developed to deal with the issue. That's where the knowledge is within the government, but they don't have the authority to work off base, in the country. Yet they could be empowered, and I'm not sure executive order is the right word. I don't know what this administration uses. We used to have presidential directives that were issued basically for the president doing his job and requiring those who work for him to do their jobs. And that's what's needed. No one is in charge in this government in dealing with this problem below the president. That's fundamentally the fact of life.
Yeah. Kelly, anything you want to add on that point?
Not so much. Everybody kind of expressed probably better than I could.
Okay. Well, let me just add one point on it, because I think that what's been said here is absolutely true. The place where this connects to politics, of course, is where two things happen. On the one hand, you have the legislators and others in the executive branch too, I guess, naturally turning to the electric utilities themselves for counsel on what needs to be done and how much it will cost to do it and so on. And as Peter has said, when the default setting for the industry is basically no, we don't want to do it, we don't want the regulations, we don't want the costs, whatever they might be, the message back to those who might, if they were given other information, prompt those legislators and executive branch officials and so on to take action. They don't. So I think that's one issue. And the second is that these utilities, I'd like to think that many, if not all of them, recognize that they have as much of a stake, if not more, given all of their assets on the line, than the rest of us do in fixing this problem. I think, and our purpose in the Secure the Grid Coalition is seeing what can be done to work with them to actually get them in a leadership role rather than in a objecting role. And if that happens, I think that we can get this thing sorted out fairly quickly with the right, executive branch impulses, legislation where needed, and cooperation from the industry. But it is going to take something of a sea change in their attitude from what it is at the moment, and we're trying to help encourage that. Yes, ma'am.
Two questions, actually. Leandra Bernstein, RIA Novosti. The first question to follow up on this discussion, we used to have regulated utilities, and if they weren't private companies now with private interests and for-profit interests, I mean, maybe there would be an incentive, but that doesn't exist. Do you not see this as a problem? And I have another question, but I had to ask that.
Do you want to put the second one out there as well, and we'll address both of them?
Sure. The second question, you raised the threat of state actors with the EMP attacks. It seems to me that those threats could be deterred. Terrorist threats, that's it's difficult, but it's also a hit or miss. But with the threat from space, from solar flares, those kinds of events, that seems the most inevitable. So so if you could just comment on the ranking of these threats.
Good, thank you. Peter?
Well, the first question about the utilities, the electric power industry is the only critical infrastructure which is not regulated the way, for example, the transportation sector is regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Motor Vehicles and things of that sort, and that is part of the problem. It's the only critical infrastructure which in effect is allowed to regulate itself. And I'm not a big fan of big government or excessive regulation, but this is why we have government. I mean, the constitutional role to provide for the common defense. And in this case, it does appear that since the electric power industry is not willing to take on the responsibility to defend itself, that the government is going to have to take care of the problem, which hopefully we will achieve by passage of things like the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act or the SHIELD Act or the GRID Act. As to the question of deterring state actors, the problem is deterrence doesn't always work. The deterrence theory has been around a long time, and we've had a lot of wars. World War I broke out even though everybody warned. There were whole books written, before World War I that the machine gun was going to make war obsolete, and because the casualties would be so great that no rational actor would ever go to war. But we did go to war, didn't we? World War II was the same thing, that the strategic bomber and the experience of World War I proved that no rational actor would ever engage in a war again. And that's what Neville Chamberlain staked his hopes on. That's why he trusted Hitler. But the war came, and millions of people died. So I think it would be imprudent of us to continue to trust our lives and our children's lives to the hope that deterrence will work always, especially with actors that are willing to throw away their lives. And consider Iran. I mean, for example, their philosophy, this as it was described so accurately by Chairman Dempsey recently, as having this apocalyptic, eschatological, end-of-time vision that they have. I mean, in effect, Iran is a giant truck bomb. And if they get the bomb, some of us think they already have the bomb. They're a nuclear truck bomb. And it doesn't matter that their country would be destroyed. They might not be deterred. The other thing is, to deter them, you have to know who attacked you. I mean, that's the first principle of deterrence. That's why the Congressional EMP Commission considered it a nightmare scenario what North Korea did, because we might not be able to ever figure out who hit us if they did it that way, if they did it by launching short-range missiles off a freighter, or if they used a meteorological balloon to loft a warhead to altitude over the eastern grid from a freighter. And this satellite, if it was detonated on the first pass before it passed our ballistic missile early warning radars in the north, we might not see that coming or ever knew who did it. So there are ways for state actors to attack us so that they can keep our fingerprints off it, and that would make the deterrence non-operational.
And the other piece of it, which I might just add, that Peter, among others, has pointed out, is when you look at, for example, and maybe you mentioned it just now, Peter, but to emphasize the point, you look at the doctrine of the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans and the Iranians, they call for electromagnetic pulse as part of a cyber laydown in furtherance of their strategic objectives. So it's, again, not simply imputing to them or making assumptions about how they might conduct themselves. Hank?
I just wanted to add a thought. Everyone points at Iran, when they get the bomb. And as Peter says, some believe that they may already have it. People forget that Pakistan has, I think it's commonly acknowledged, over 100 nuclear weapons. They're supposed to be secure, safe, managed by the military, et cetera, et cetera. But you do have to remember that Osama bin Laden spent 9 years, was it, something like that in Pakistan within, I don't know, a few miles or less than a mile of one of the major military facilities there. The military may be looking out for our interests, but then again, I don't know how you predict the future, and it's not hard to imagine scenarios by which the terrorists who won't be deterred might get their hands on a weapon out of Pakistan or even out of the former Soviet Union. They've got a few thousand weapons we don't count in our arms control world. They're called tactical nuclear weapons.
I would just add one thing. Speaking of Pakistan, Pakistan right now is going through a lot of political turmoil. And as a consequence, we're seeing Islamic activity picking up there. And already the chief cleric to the Red Mosque has sworn allegiance to ISIS. If Pakistan were to fall, it gives them access to nuclear weapons. And I've actually had buddies of mine, my contacts within Lebanon, who have interviewed ISIS personnel in Syria, basically say, we can obtain nuclear weapons. And the most logical thought to me would be from Pakistan. And with the head of the Red Mosque, the cleric head of the Red Mosque, swearing allegiance now to al-Baghdadi, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of Islamic State, that really is of concern to me in terms of his outreach and the potential for the establishment of that caliphate. I would also add that we need to be very concerned internally about lone wolves in the United States. And certainly lone wolves will be sought out by ISIS and what have you to work. Already the FBI is very concerned about lone wolves. And what can lone wolves do? The lone wolves might be shooting out these transformers. Lone wolves also are known to be able to make EMP weapons, but there are websites that advertise how to make an EMP weapon and how to upgrade it.
Can I just mention one other thing on the regulation piece? There is a whole nother level of regulation that is at the state level. Those are basically for the less powerful transmission lines and transformers. And one of the things that the Secure the Grid Coalition has been doing, with help from several of our colleagues here, is trying to develop with various states around the country, notably Maine, Arizona, Virginia, Florida, South Carolina, and others, a situational awareness of this problem and a degree of initiative at their own level, rather than wait for the feds, which may not materialize in time, to see what they might do to make their grids more resilient and protect their populations. So this is another area of activity of the coalition, and I want to thank our colleagues who've been involved in that. Peter, quickly, I want to take another question.
Okay, I just wanted to wrap up the nuclear deterrence and the idea of one of the countries Pakistan was mentioned, but I'm particularly concerned about North Korea, which already has the bomb and will sell anything to anybody. North Korea is a notorious missile and nuclear proliferator. All of Iran's ballistic missiles are basically based on North Korean technology. The KSM-3 satellite and the space booster was based on North Korean Taepodong boosters, and North Koreans are in Iran, helping them develop their missile technology. North Korea a few years ago was trying to build a nuclear bomb factory in Syria, which fortunately the Israelis took out. Can you imagine if they had not done that and we had an advanced nuclear weapons program in Syria today? Yeah. Finally, there's an interest in countries like North Korea and Iran in proliferating weapons to organizations like ISIS or Al-Qaeda precisely to make deterrence fail. You know, because if they wanted to do a nuclear EMP attack on the United States, say, why not have a surrogate do it? You know, ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and it would distance you from the attack. So there's all kinds of pathways we can see where we should not be relying on deterrence. It's a very weak strategy for protecting our country in this environment.
I know Hank wants to come back, but we'll take another question from the back. Yes, ma'am.
Nancy Mingus. I have the privilege of working with Frank on Latin American policy, and The question I wanted to ask is, if legislation were passed, then is it up to the utility companies to fund hardening the grid? And you mentioned that it wasn't that expensive to do, but is it not something that the United States could, the government itself, could help the utilities to do if they are so opposed to any type of regulation? Thank you.
Good question. Who would like to take that?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, the EMP Commission estimated it would cost about $2 billion to protect the national electric grid. You know, that is what we give away every year in foreign aid to Pakistan. And yeah, there are I think the government could appropriate money and pay it. The way we normally think about paying it is allowing them to pass the costs on to ratepayers. The U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission estimated it would raise the average ratepayer's electric bill by something like 20 cents a year, you know, if they were to do that. But ultimately, it really isn't the money. I can't get into it, but we had a recent conversation, Frank and I, with a person from the electric power industry on this very thing, and an offer was made, you know, about well, what if we paid for it? And it made no impression at all. I really think it's about the power and not the money. You know, they don't want the government having that regulatory authority over their industry, and I think that's the primary reason for their opposition.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on that. It seems to me if I were an executive in the power company, I'd prefer to do it and pass it on to the subscriber. I mean, the expense is not that great, and I wouldn't want to take any more government money than I had to. It seems to me that fits with their apprehension. So we need to get them just to pay attention to this issue. I also want to make one other observation. I believe personally that the National Guard is key to our working this problem in the long run. They have statutory responsibilities. They belong to the governors, as you, I assume, know, unless they're federalized. And so they have connections within the states to the local authorities and the state authorities in preparing to deal with these issues. And if they get to the point where they understand the issue and know what to do to deal with it, then I believe we'll see things move from the local level up through them to the federal level through the Defense Department and other places.
Kelly, if you have anything you want to add, just jump in here.
Okay.
Let me just make one last point on this. Another issue, and Peter sort of touched on it earlier.